Hello and welcome to Cornell Keynotes. My name is Brad Bell. I'm the William J. Kennedy Professor of Strategic Human Resources in the ILR School at Cornell. And I also serve as the Academic Director of our Center for Advanced Human Resource Studies, or CAHRS as we like to call it. Very excited to be joined by my colleagues Chris Collins and Kevin Cox for the final keynote in our 5-part series around the CAHRS World-Class HR Business Partner Framework. In today's keynote, we will examine the crucial role that HRBPs play in creating a compelling employee value proposition. As part of today's discussion, we'll be looking at the different ways in which HRBPs can not only shape workplace culture, but also help to create a positive employee experience that enhances engagement and ultimately builds a strong EVP. We hope to have some time left at the end of today's discussion for some Q&A, so welcome you at any point to submit your questions into the chat, and we'll take those at the end. So before we dive into today's session, I'd like to take a moment and introduce my colleagues. Here in the studio, I'm joined by Chris Collins, who is a professor of HR studies in the ILR School at Cornell. Chris is a former director of CAHRS and currently leads our Master's in Industrial and Labor Relations graduate program. Chris has actually done quite a bit of work over the last few years focused on the employee experience, really understanding how organizations think about it, different ways to shape it. So look forward to his insights on today's topic. And joining us remotely is Kevin Cox, who is the founder and president of LKC Advisory and is currently serving as CAHRS Executive Fellow. Kevin retired last year as General Electric's CHRO and previously served as CHRO of both American Express and Pepsi Bottling Group. Obviously, all companies with very well-known and well-regarded employee value propositions. So again, look forward to Kevin's insight on today's topic. As we've done over the last several keynotes, we'll be starting today with a short video which features a couple CHROs from our CAHRS partner companies, specifically Procter & Gamble and Workday. So we asked these CHROs to talk a little bit about what they see as the role of their HR business partners in really shaping and driving employee value propositions. So let's see what they had to say.
Human centricity. We have an increasingly diverse set of employees in our organizations. 4 different generations represented at the same time, different cultures. In many organizations for us, a global representation as we support our customers and our employees everywhere. So an ability to understand people where they are at and to be able to adapt the environment in our company to serve every employee. So the H of HR has never been more important. And second, to understand people where they're at and to be able to customize at scale the employee experience for each and every one of our employees. Our aspiration is for every one of our 100,000 employees, we want each of them to feel like the company has been uniquely designed for them so that they individually, each one of them can be at their very best on behalf of the company and on behalf of our customers.
A third is being a truly trusted talent advisor and confidant to really help navigate these very complex people issues, to help leaders give that tough feedback, to create that safe space where other leaders in the organization can be vulnerable, and especially in times of significant change like this one, where we're getting organizations getting pressure from technology and taking up new technologies and AI from investors, from employees. This is a time where that trusted confidant is truly needed.
So Chris and Kevin, I'd love to get your reactions to the videos, and maybe Kevin, I'll start with you. I'm kind of curious about what you attribute Bala's emphasis on human centricity to. Is it that in our quest to really get that seat at the table and be that true business partner, that we've maybe over-aligned ourselves with the business and have lost some of that touch with the kind of employee experience? Or is it that maybe new tools and technologies are creating a new opportunity for us to really create a very personalized experience for every employee, as Bala talked about, or is there something else kind of underlying his emphasis on that human centricity? What are your thoughts there?
There's a lot there, Brad. Bala's a very talented head of HR. I think that he's talking mostly about the employee experience part of the framework. So if you look at the framework, on the far right side under employee value proposition, there really are two headers there. One of them is employee experience. And I think that he's probably referring to that when he talks about this human centricity comment. I think that he's probably making a broad point to HR in general, and maybe to the HRBP population in particular. You know, Brad, there's always been huge pressure on HR to do what is in the best interest of shareholders or ownership. That is not new. That's been that way since I've been on the scene, and I'm sure well before that, it'll always be there. I think Bal is reminding us that over the long term, the companies that win over the long term really have to win the battle for the hearts and minds of employees. And there are many distractions these days. So that battle has never been more difficult, but I would say it's never been more important. P&G must be getting close to 200 years old. And so when you think about a company like that, and Bal is talking about trying to deliver a custom employee experience to 100,000 people at scale, that is a very tough do. So I believe he's talking about employee experience there. And your last question, if I got it right, on tools and technology, without question, there are definitely great tools and great technologies coming on the scene just rapidly. And I'm excited about those. And I think that's going to take our business and our profession to another level. But I don't think there's anything that I'm aware of currently or even on the horizon that's going to do the job that great leadership really does in this battle for the heart and minds of employees. And if you're trying to create a great employee value proposition, or if you're trying to create a great employee experience or build a really powerful organizational culture, leadership is going to be probably the single greatest lever that you have to do that. It can make it, and unfortunately, I'm here to tell you it can break it if it isn't thought about and handled well. So I think tools and technology are great. I'm excited about them for sure. I would ask us as an HR community and an HRBP community not to overlook the tried and true value of leadership as we try to create these great employee value propositions.
You know, I'm curious about Ashley's comments, you know, around the kind of trusted advisor, the HRBP, which seems to go back to some of our earlier keynotes where we talked about the talent and leadership, you know, bucket, for example. You know, but what I heard in that is really this idea of HRBPs really need to partner and work with their business leaders to co-create that employee experience, or at least to get them on board with that. So, you know, what did you see there and what she was talking about?
So I think I've spent a lot of time over the last 20 years thinking about how do we attract people to organizations, what makes them stay. I see increasingly where employees are is they're looking at the full experience. So at one point in time, I think, you know, there's a tendency to think if you pay them well, if you give them growth opportunities, everything's good. I think across the board, people have come to expect a consumer experience at work. And that means they're looking at how is their manager impacting them? How does IT impact them? How does the design of the workplace itself? And so the HRBP is really in the center of all this, trying to think about who to influence. And that's where throughout our model, we really talked about this idea of, you know, what's your role in working with leaders? What's your role working across functions? And those functions could be HR functions. They could be business functions. So it's really creating that holistic experience. And I think we are, as HRBPs, at the center point of seeing where there's frictions and who to partner with to reduce them.
Yeah, makes sense. So let's turn now to the framework. And as you've already alluded to, Kevin, you know, when we look at this kind of employee value proposition part of the framework, we've really broken it down into two pieces. The, you know, first being around organizational culture. And Kevin, I'd like to really get you to dig in a bit to that piece. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what you see as a role of HRBPs in defining, shaping, and reinforcing organizational culture? You know, specifically, why is this, you know, aspect of the framework important? But also, what are some of the processes or actions that HRBPs need to be engaging in to really, you know, do that organizational culture piece well?
Well, some of you are fortunate enough to work in maybe a very decentralized company. Maybe somebody out there is in a portfolio company owned by private equity. or a really unique division of a conglomerate. And if you're that HRBP, you may actually have the license and the expectation to create a culture, to kind of co-create a culture with the leader of that business. That's a really special moment. If you have that opportunity, I would say that's kind of a once in a career, once in a lifetime kind of thing to do. Take full advantage of it. But it's pretty rare. Awesome if you've got it, but it's pretty rare. For the rest of us, what most of us are better off probably thinking about on culture is, first of all, understanding the leadership culture that the senior leaders of the organization are really standing for and trying to create. Understanding what that is, not being casual, not reading about it on a piece of paper, but actually trying to understand what are we trying to change or what are we trying to make better about this culture. Understand that. And once you understand it, I've always thought my role as an HRBP was to hold leadership accountable for whatever that promise was. And Brad, I'm going to say it one more time. My job is to hold leaders accountable for the culture promise. So if I had a leader that was saying we need to be more innovative and we need to be faster in our decision making, and I was working on a business unit team where leaders were doing the opposite of that, slow, deliberate, super concerned with kind of risk analysis, very internally focused, not very externally aware. You know, it's my job to say, gang, this isn't what we really are being asked to do. And we've got to either behave differently as leaders, or in some cases, we may need different leaders. And it might be my job to kind of help bring about that change. But I always thought that was my problem to fix. If the culture isn't operating as it was promised, I always accepted that as my responsibility to try to make that better. And I felt like I had tools to do it. For example, I could influence who's on the leadership team. I may not have control over that, but I could definitely influence that. I could influence what behaviors we were paying for. What are we rewarding? And how's the compensation design? Is that reinforcing culture, or is it actually confusing culture? And as I said, rarely, but sometimes removing leaders that were acting in direct opposition to the culture and were unwilling or unable to change, that was a lever too. So if there's some manufacturing folks out there, I think we're the quality assurance function as it relates to culture. Sometimes we co-create it, but always I think we have to deliver on the promise or make the changes necessary in order to have that culture be realized. That's how I think about it.
That's great, Kevin. Maybe just, as I was hearing you share that, thinking about how you use rewards or just thinking about who's on the team, that all makes sense. I'm guessing there's times where you need to go and sit down with those leaders and have that conversation. You talk about wanting to drive speed, but yet you're engaging in all this over analysis. I mean, how would you approach those conversations, or when would you decide when you needed to have that really direct conversation with the leader about you're not really living the culture that we're trying to create here?
Well, first of all, I think it's that person's leader's job to do a good bit of that. I do believe in the chain of command. Sometimes they're flat and sometimes they're pretty layered, but I do think you shouldn't work against the design and the structure of your company. So if there's a way to check maybe with my boss, hey, Brad is not exactly demonstrating the kind of leadership. Have you talked to him about that? And maybe they have, maybe they haven't. That's always a good place to start. Let's assume they have, and Brad still maybe needs to make some changes in that. Well, that's when a private conversation makes a lot of sense. I'm a big believer in what was taught to me as camera lens feedback. In other words, I wouldn't go say, Brad, I've heard Chris told me that I would be more we were just in this meeting and we were talking about this need to accelerate innovation. And what I was hearing from you or seeing from you was a whole lot of stop signs and a whole lot of why this won't work. And that's killing the innovation vibe that we're really trying to create in this company. I know you mean well. I know we should be mindful of those risks, but I don't think you're delivering the kind of balance that we really need and want you to deliver. Is there a way you might approach that differently? So what I saw, not what somebody told me, standing up for my own views and my own values, and trying to be as encouraging as I can versus as judgmental or as kind of maybe unfair as I might be. That's how I would do it. That's how I have done it.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thanks, Kevin. I love that idea of the camera lens, that feedback. That makes a lot of sense. So Chris, maybe I'll move over to you to talk a little bit about the other part of the framework, which is that kind of employee experience piece. And can you talk a little bit about how HR and HRBPs specifically can really create value for employees and enhance that experience? What they need to be thinking about, what they need to be doing there.
Yeah. So the idea of this employee experience is pretty comprehensive, right? In terms of all the things you experience at work. And so, I think part of the role of the HRBP and where they're perfectly positioned is they've got access, right? So they are hopefully out talking to those employees, understanding where there's frustrations. Is there frustrations about things that are not necessarily under my control, but I'm a great conduit of that information back to others. So that listening tour, the building relationships with people outside of just your senior leadership team so that you've got people feeding you information. A huge role here, I think, for HRBPs is seeing those patterns and seeing where there's issues. Some of that might be feeding it back to the corporate HR teams to design this from the corporate side in terms of alleviating these problems or giving people more access to information. Some of it might be to leaders, to Kevin's point, like pulling someone aside and saying, here's what's going on in your team. How do we make this better for all of them so they can, get more out of the work that they're doing? And so I think part of it is the seeing, part of it is the influence, and then part of it is decision making of which of these things are most important to tackle first, because there's often lots of things. And as much as I love Bala's idea of crafting the workplace for all 100,000 employees, that's really hard. Like, you can certainly do that on things that are automatable. So benefits, information around how many days do I have left for vacation, right? That stuff, everyone should get their own Amazon-like experience where the AI is feeding them specific information to them. As an HRBP, I'm trying to look for the big pattern. So in a plant, what's causing problems on first shift? In a sales team, what's causing the most pain for our field sales group or our field service group? So I'm looking more for big patterns, and then who can I partner with to turn the tide and make those experiences better?
So, a lot of times when we talk about the employee experience, you hear companies talk about moments that matter. And I know in the work that you've done, you've thought about those moments occur with different frequency. There's some things that maybe occur every day, and there's some things that occur once in a career. I think it goes to your point around which things do we really need to be prioritizing, which things do we don't. But how should HRBPs think about that? Because I imagine the risk here is getting flooded with a bunch of employees that think everything's important, and really figuring out how do we manage this to create the best employee experience possible.
That's where, again, I think trying to understand their perspective, first of all. So, I think one of the lost arts within management, certainly within HR, is that ability to hear a lot of information and synthesize it into patterns, right? So I think, we got so used to having information fed to us. I think we've got to go out there and find it, but then make sense of it and figure out which of these are consistent patterns, which of these are one-off, which of these matter the most, that we can work on the things that do matter. I do see, a lot of the day-to-day stuff for HRBPs probably being the most essential for them to focus on, because those things are happening every day. Those build up quickly for employees. If every day they're frustrated by how they have to clock in, or every day they're frustrated with the technology they work on, or every day they're frustrated with the noise and the difficulty of getting their tasks complete. Those things probably are most important to work on first. I think there's other times that are things that people reflect on periodically throughout the year. Do I feel like I'm making progress? Do I feel like I've got opportunities? Do I feel like I'm still learning? So I think those are things you're trying to capture general sense over the course of time, but the day-to-day stuff builds up really quickly. So I think you're seeing that probably more frequently too.
I guess, one more question, then we'll go to some of the audience questions because we have some coming in. And for those of you watching, encourage other questions that you might have. Kevin, I'll maybe go to you because Chris, you alluded to, and I had the same thought watching Bala's, he referred to it as aspirational, so maybe it's more conceptual, but this idea of really customizing the employee experience each and every employee. We know HR often likes standardization, they like consistency. So how do you think, or how did you think about that, Kevin, when you were in role in terms of how do we create a consistent employee experience, yet making it personalized enough so it's resonating or meeting individual needs that different employees or different groups of employees might have?
Yeah, I think Chris's answer is a pretty good one on that too. There are some tasks that definitely deserve to be automated and therefore could be maybe more customized from a technology standpoint. There are two properties that I think are good levers to try to move the needle on this. One of them is onboarding. And I can hear the eyes roll all over the world as I'm saying this right now, but I'll just sort of beg you to be with me on this. Have you ever walked into a brand new restaurant, just opened, and you're really excited about it? And you take your family or your friends and you go there, and your initial experience is terrible. They're understaffed, nobody comes to your table. The table hasn't been cleaned before the prior guest was there. What are the odds that you're going to go back and give that a second chance? I worry so much about the first experience that talent has when they join our companies, and whether it's like that bad restaurant example, or whether it's a very welcoming, very good kind of first day, first week. And onboarding doesn't mean provisioning and getting your laptop. It means like, who is actually welcoming you into the company and who is actually making you feel like you belong here. I think that property is under-leveraged and worth a lot more thought. And the second one, Chris, you mentioned like a lost art of focus and synthesizing. Another lost art is the quality of frontline supervision. Years ago, we used to spend a lot of time on the quality of the leaders of the flattest part of the pyramid. How good are they? How are we teaching them how to manage? Some of them are in their first management job. There's so little of that goes on out there right now. And so what you're left with is people, grab a YouTube video and kind of maybe try to figure out, how do I manage? Or they ask ChatGPT, how do I manage? So thinking harder about frontline leadership, I think, is something that will also deliver a much better experience. And I think that's scalable. I think if you do a little there, you get a lot of leverage. That's how I would think about it.
Great.
Just to build off that, and tied to the holiday season. So I once had a senior leader talking to me about my leadership. This is back when I was leading others, and basically said, "Do you know what gift you would give to each of your employees during the holidays?" And if you can't answer that, then you're not doing this customization, right? So some of the greatest customization of the employee experience is going to happen at that frontline leadership level. So it doesn't have to be about a gift, but are you giving people different feedback because they're at different stages? Are you having different conversations with them about their career because they're in different places? That so much of the customization of the employee experience isn't necessarily it's HR, it's how well we built our leaders. And so again, where would I double down as an HRBP in the employee experience spaces? I'd be working with those leaders that need the most jump to actually give the better experience to employees.
That's great. Makes a lot of sense. So let's go into some of the questions. We've got a number of questions coming in. So, one that kind of caught my eye is around employee engagement, because, for those of you at home, as we were developing this framework, in earlier iterations, we had actually kind of called this box employee engagement and, pivoted away from that. But obviously engagement is tightly tied in here and is a key outcome of the employee value proposition. So, the question is around, a number of recent reports kind of are highlighting the employee engagement as an all-time low. So, why do we think this is, and what can companies really do to address it? So, Kevin, maybe I'll pose that question to you first.
That's easy, Brad. Thanks. You're getting me back for using you as an example in my Well, I think there's a lot of reasons that consumer sentiment is also really, really low. People are worried about geopolitics. People are worried about the future of work. They are worried about how far AI is really going to go. They're worried about all sorts of things. So I guess I accept the fact that it's legitimate for people to have some pretty serious concerns on their mind. And I believe that that's going to show up in some of our measured metrics and things like that on engagement. And we can't control very much of that at all. No one can. So what we can control, though, I think is the performance of the company. You guys have done more, statistical research than I have, but even though a lot of people think that great engagement drives great performance, I think maybe just about as many think that great performance drives great engagement. One way or another, it seems to me to be a pretty virtuous cycle. So I would get really, really focused on performing better as a company as the best antidote to a lot of the concerns and a lot of the anxiety that is legitimately out there. Think about how we get great performance and believe that engagement comes up with that. And if you still think there are things to work on, as long as I've been doing this, and I think for the foreseeable future, manager quality drives engagement. We know that. No one argues with that. Back to the point on frontline leadership. Role clarity drives engagement. If I know what you want me to do, I am a lot more likely to A, do it, and B, feel pretty good about succeeding there. And a culture that is at a minimum fair and where leadership is generally trusted, those are things that drive engagement. So I think all of us have things to work on, but those are the tried and true: performance, manager quality, trust, fairness from a cultural standpoint, and don't forget about role clarity. If you ask most people, give them a good, tight job to do, most people want to succeed in that. It's the ones that are confused that I think can bring down engagement for the team. Those would be my thoughts.
So Chris, there's a question here I'll pose to you from Ryan. It asks, how do you effectively build trust and become a confidant as a business partner while also being able to push the business managers, leaders to really meet the needs of the organization? So I think it's, how do you maintain a certain degree of distance or objectivity where you can be that trusted confidant, so you can have influence and be heard, but at the same time, you're not so quote unquote in bed with the leader that you can't maybe give them some difficult feedback or push them in new directions?
Yes, Ryan, thank you. There's a very long answer to that, I think. The shortest answer I have is time and how you show up, right? So I think if time means you got to put the time in, you got to go build the relationships, you got to get to know them, they get to know you. And I think that's for your leadership team. I think that's for the employees that you're supporting. Like, no one trusts you if you don't spend time with them. I think then if you're delivering on what you say you're going to deliver, that builds some of that trust, that belief in you, that you actually live up to your word. So if I go collect information from employees, I'm doing that listening and they tell me, here's something we're really frustrated with, and they never see anything come of that, then you lose that credibility pretty quickly. Same thing on the managerial end. If I say, hey, doing these things is going to be really important, here's how that's going to drive employees to work harder, perform better, and nothing ever comes of it, again, you lose that credit. So I think it's that combination of time, building the relationships, talking, having your talking points, being able to make the connections, but then actually delivering for both sides around that, I think is critical of that kind of circular loop of building the faith and trust in you.
Yeah, great. So Kevin, maybe I'll present this question to you, which is, somewhat related, but really gets at, question is, as an HRBP, I often find myself trying to balance my dual role as an employee advocate on the one side and really a partner of the business on the other side. So what is your advice to HRBPs that are trying to walk that tightrope between those two parts of their role?
Believe it or not, Brad, I would say walk away from that word balance. Balance suggests that sort of the more you do of one, the less you do of the other. And I I think you're setting yourself up to fail if you frame it as a balance question. I think you're going to deal with it all the time. And for those of you that might want to go on and maybe run HR and be a chief people officer, a chief human resource officer one day, you'll deal with that even then, where the stakes are arguably even higher. So this is a subject that I really think is important to become comfortable with. The way I thought about it was, how do I integrate? Not balance, but how do I integrate? I will always have a responsibility as an advocate for employees. I feel like as long as I did the job, I never ever walked away from that core responsibility. If I'm not standing up for employees and their interests, then who is or who will? So that's part of it. On the other hand, I am here to make this organization more successful, to create growth, to create opportunities for all of these employees. And you have to do both. And there are times when you have to do hard things at the organization, like a restructuring or a layoff, in order to create the capacity for growth for the next generation. And you have to become comfortable with that. You should never feel like it's easy, and you should never look forward to it, but you have to become comfortable with it. Again, the way a doctor might get comfortable giving some tough medicine in order to save a patient. That's how I think about it. But fundamentally, Brad, as opposed to balancing the two, I think about integrating the two as sort of an unlock, or at least that's how I thought about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful distinction you're making there, Kevin. So I think we have time for another question or two. So Chris, maybe I'll go to you on this one first. The question is around, we've been kind of talking about shaping the employee experience or culture. Increasingly, organizations are operating at least partially virtually, where employees are spending a fraction, or some cases all of their time outside of the office. So how do we think about organizational culture, the employee experience, when employees might not be on site as much, or if at all?
Another one I've spent a lot of time thinking about, particularly as we emerge from the pandemic and more people realize they like to work virtually, or they don't really want to come back to the office because of the hassle of commute, or maybe they've moved further away. I think it can go one of two ways. I think companies, some are sliding much more to the, hey, we're just going to have a bunch of free agents. And those companies are going to become more like constant, project management of assigning tasks. And I'm not sure there'll be such a strong, coherent culture, because I think it's harder to have that when people are spread out. I think maybe if they work together a lot virtually, they start to develop their culture of how they work together virtually. But I think that deeper culture, the deeper experience, it's hard when people aren't connected in a physical place in some ways. I think the companies that want to keep that culture have to work extra hard to help people understand what that culture is, really think about how they feel that virtually, how if some people are in person and some are virtual, how that's a shared experience that they have together. I think it just gets harder when people are spread out further and spend less time together. So I think the more you're on that end of the scale, I just think it puts either more work, or you just move to everyone's kind of a paid help and they do their individual task, and we don't worry about it.
How about Kevin? I mean, you managed HR through the pandemic, the early post-pandemic days when employees were primarily working virtually. So how did you try to maintain organizational culture, that employee experience, when your employees were maybe spending more time off-site than on-site?
Well, again, I'm going to build on Chris's point. I think if you have made a business model choice to be remote or heavily hybrid, you are signing up for a less defined culture. You just need to kind of accept that. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying you will not have as strong a culture if that's the choice you make. Another choice you make is you are trading the osmosis of getting together and being together in space for more intentional and more tactical communication. So step one, if that's what you want to do, you're going to have to dial up the frequency of leader dialogue with individuals. It's the only way that you can bring them along. And if you believe you can kind of leave them out there wherever there is and have them kind of stay with you, again, I think you're going to be mistaken about that. So dial up the frequency of communication. The other thing, and what I did specifically, I tried to make the moments count. I think you mentioned earlier moments that matter when we would come together. And sometimes that was in an offsite. Sometimes that was sort of, we're going to come together on Wednesday of every week. I really overthought, how do you make those moments matter? I wanted somebody to come back and say, I'm glad I did that because I would not have gotten blank unless I had been there. And I used to make offsites. These were not expensive or glamorous, but I would find unique speakers to come in and talk about unique subjects that would only have been possible, almost like a TED Talk. It would only have been possible if people got together and talked. And I wanted them to be stimulated by that. I wanted them to feel appreciated by that. And I wanted them to look forward to the next time they might come together. Otherwise, if you just say everybody's got to come here on Wednesday and people are on 9 different video screens in 9 different rooms, they go home and they tell their partner, I have no idea why they wanted me to come to work today. I could have done this from home. You've got to arrest that logical conclusion, I think, by really being intentional about what you do when you are together in space.
That's great. So a couple other questions, that really interesting questions have come in. So let's tackle these real quick, maybe rapid fire around here. But Chris, I'll direct this question from Kate to you. Just kind of highlighting that, particularly in larger companies, HRBP role has, as she refers to as, has become increasingly ivory towered, meaning really aligned with the senior most management, maybe has lost that linkage to the employee, frontline employee themselves. And it's kind of highlighting, is the kind of art of listening, synthesizing, all the things you talked about, is that somewhat of a lost art? And how do HRBPs get back to that?
Yeah, I think Kate raised a great question. Is structurally, what we've seen many companies do, and particularly larger companies, is they've created this much larger span of control for HRBPs. I think in these bigger roles that are supposed to be more strategic, I think it's also super seductive to spend all of your time with the senior leadership team. I think that's at your own disservice, right? If you're not that person who's out building those relationships with other people throughout the organization, the flow of information just doesn't come up. We can't do that through just AI sensing what's going on in the workplace or hoping someone else surfaces that to us. If we are that HRBP, I think you've got to structure your time to go out and build those other relationships, to go have the conversations with these people so you develop that trust. There is a flow of information, because that is a huge part of your role. Still is, it's hard to advocate for the employees if you don't know what the employees need. It's hard to know what problems to solve if you're not really feeling the pulse of what's going on. So I would say, don't stop meeting with your senior team, but make sure you're getting out of that space to do more.
Yeah, it's a great reminder.
By the way, you can do more with at a little bit of scale, Chris. In the old days, when you had a smaller job, you might be able to go individually, and you can get a lot done in a focus group, a skip level, whatever you want to call it, and build some of those relationships and talk about common areas of need. But I really love your point. You have to be intentional about carving out the time to do that. If you make the space for it, the demand is clearly there for you.
So Kevin, I'd like to pose this question from Peyton to you, and it's somewhat related. I mean, basically it's talking about the fact that, as HRBPs, we're often short-staffed, we're often a small team, everything that our customers, all their issues are high priority or, burning issues. So we really need to figure out, what do we focus on and how do we decide where to prioritize? My head's going back to some of our early keynotes where we talked about using this framework for things like contracting with a leader to really kind of lay out, all this is important, but what's most important right now for this business. But other thoughts that you might have on how to handle that prioritization exercise.
Actually, Brad, let's stay right there. Peyton, you could not have asked, I don't know if this is the last question, but if it is, you couldn't have picked a better one to send us out on. the whole reason we have this framework is to help you answer that question, Peyton. And so the contracting that Brad talked about, to be able to go to your principals, whoever they are, whether it's a business unit team or a GM or a division president, whoever that might be, function head, lay this model down and spend some time and say, I realize we have 100 fires that you expect me to put out, and I will continue to do that as best I can. But what are the big areas where we really want to try to move the needle? And there can only be one or two of them. And here's a menu of the most likely suspects. And so when you think about the business, you think about your leadership, how can I use this framework to focus my energy, or maybe, remember the blue layer there, maybe the energy of the COEs or the folks back at headquarters to get after a couple of these bigger items. This contracting, as you put it, Brad, is the perfect way to think about it. You cut a deal that we are going to work on this together, in addition to the smaller, more urgent, more tactical things that we know we have to do. That's a big part of the reason why I was so excited to help put this model together with the two of you and present it to everybody that's been able to join us in these podcasts.
Yeah, I'll just tack on, it's also defining for yourself some focus, right? Because I think, again, much like sitting with a senior leadership team is seductive, I think doing lots of little things is seductive. It's like watching a whole bunch of TikTok or YouTube shorts. It's like the endorphins of like all these little tasks that you've accomplished. So I think part of it's also setting some time to say, what are the big things I need to work on? And which of these can I ignore right now because I just don't need the endorphin rush? I need to make some big impact here. So I think part of it is also our nature of like, where do we get the fastest reward versus what's the long-term play? And I'd spend more on the long-term play.
Yeah, great. So I think as you highlight, Kevin, that's kind of a full circle moment. So I think that's a great way to close it out. Just a few things before we wrap up. For those of you that have been along with us throughout this keynote series, we really appreciate you coming along on this journey with us. I know I speak for Kevin and Chris when I say we've really enjoyed it. We've appreciated your engagement. I've got a lot of additional insights through all of your comments and questions along the way. If this was the first of these keynotes that you've attended, thanks for joining us. We would encourage you to visit the landing page, that link that was put in the chat. We have all the recordings of the prior keynotes there. You can download a version of the framework. Those CHRO videos that we've been showing are also available there. So we encourage you to go look at the other keynotes, but also share it with others in your network. We really want this framework to be used as broadly as possible, wherever anybody thinks it might be helpful. So please do share it out with others. We also encourage you to stay tuned. Visit that landing page. We'll be adding updates along the way. Visit our CAHRS webpage, where we have a number of other events throughout the year. And as we continue to develop this work, refine the model, come up with collateral, support it, we'll be coming back to you with additional events and updates throughout 2026. So stay posted for all of that. So again, thanks to Kevin, thanks to Chris for joining me throughout this series. It's been a lot of fun. And thanks for all of you for joining us, and happy holidays. And we look forward to seeing you at some point in the new year.
Happy holidays, everybody. Thank you.